to large yellow letters IN with blue broken up letters spelling visible underneath make up the logo invisible.
The following is the full interview with Lucy Matthew recorded during the filming of the documentary Invisible in June 2022, funded by the British Academy. Directed by Anica, Zeyen and Wadaby. Interview conducted by Dr. Anica Zeyen. Anica Zeyen is a white woman with dark blonde hair. In her background is a sofa and her guide dog Lassie, a yellow Labrador, sleeping. The text fades and we meet Lucy, a white woman with blue hair, wearing a white top and sitting in front of a blurred background.
So I'm Lucy. I use she, her pronouns. I'm 33. I'm from South London. I'm a quite proud member of the LGBTQI plus community. And I work as a program officer, which is like a course coordinator of a postgraduate university program.
Please tell us a bit more about your disability.
I've got diagnoses of autism, anxiety and depression, and also technically I've got a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, but I now think that that's inaccurate.
How did you feel when you first found out about your diagnosis?
So my mental health issues started when I was about 14. My anxiety and depression sort of just became apparent. Anxiety was never formally diagnosed as far as I know, but I've been on medication for it several times and it's been acknowledged by medical professionals since I was a teenager. The BPD was diagnosed when I was at uni, when I was 19, which was a particularly turbulent and traumatic time. I'd just taken an overdose and yeah, it was a really difficult period of time. I was actually diagnosed by somebody who met me for a really short amount of time and didn't have nearly enough information about me or my circumstances to slap that diagnosis on me, to be honest, in my opinion. But yeah, over time and after discussion with my therapist and like people close to me, I don't feel like this is an accurate diagnosis anymore. It initially, like when I found out about the BPD, I felt relieved initially because at that point I was desperate for an explanation for my struggles and I felt that it fit at the time and adapted it as sort of part of my identity. I was largely unaware of the diagnosis before I was given it and definitely didn't understand the stigma which it held, both within society but also significantly within like medical professionals themselves, and I didn't realize like the damage that the label could do to my sense of self over the years. Then autism I was diagnosed as autistic at age 30, which was January 2020, which is interesting timing. So I was randomly allocated to the autism and learning disabilities module at work to work coordinating that. And after working closely with me for a while, one of my colleagues who's an autism expert sort of gently suggested that if I'd not been assessed for autism, then I should probably look into it. So I went away and did my own research and sought out a diagnosis via my GP, and they sent me to the local autism assessment team. And once I got diagnosed as autistic, I was completely overwhelmed to begin with. I didn't know what to do with myself or how to process it, and had like quite limited understanding and no immediate post-diagnostic support. Initially, it was really difficult because it felt like I was receiving a new diagnosis of something which would never improve, but I was looking at it from completely the wrong angle at that point. And I just simply didn't understand enough about autism. And how to distinguish autism from my mental health difficulties. But once I kind of learned more by devouring YouTube videos and books from other autistic people, I started to understand myself and autism a lot better. And getting that diagnosis has actually been a real turning point for me, and it's changed my life immeasurably for the better. That was a long ramble. I apologize.
No, that was really good. Thank you.
You can tell where I've done my prep. That's what I will say.
Could you actually talk a tiny bit more about this aspect you finished with, that now that you understand your diagnosis of autism, that it has improved your life for the better? Could you tell us how?
Yeah, so my diagnosis, now that I know, because I spent most of my life not knowing that I was autistic, and seeing a lot of different things that I struggled with as personal failures and like moral failings, character flaws, and beating myself up for them, being told by other people that they were things that I was doing wrong, or having run-ins with different people because I was doing or saying the wrong thing, or because my facial expressions and tone didn't match what I was saying or what was expected. So when I actually received my diagnosis and have processed it properly, it just meant that I gave myself a bit of a break. Like it gave me an explanation and like a framework to understand myself and my difficulties, and why I was the way that I was, and why I react in certain situations to certain things. And it's helped me to be able to put in place adaptations in my own life for myself, just simple things like wearing headphones when I go to the supermarket. Who knew that that could make such a difference to my life? And things that I wouldn't have thought of before, things that I didn't necessarily take into consideration, like sensory things, which I didn't really pay much attention to before, until I started to take notice of it. And adjustments that other people can make as well. Even now, I've just started doing DBT therapy with my private therapist, and she's amazing. And she's found that there's a neurodivergent friendly version of it, and so she's picking and choosing bits from that workbook and the standard one to like work out which would work for me best. And at work, I'm now able to have like accommodations and reasonable adjustments that help me to like get by and do that more easily. So just in all areas of life, in my relationship, it's made a massive difference, compared to past relationships. Now that I'm able to understand me and what I need, and why my reactions are the way they are, sometimes I think I've had a lot of turbulent relationships, and I think a lot of that was around just not being able to communicate effectively, or not understanding what the clash was, or sometimes me going non-verbal would be taken almost as a threat by people, and people would think that I was giving them the silent treatment, whereas actually it was just that I was completely overwhelmed and couldn't process things at all. And so it's just every single area of my life has been changed and improved for knowing that I'm autistic.
That's great to hear. And how do people respond when you disclose your different disabilities?
So with autism and anxiety, I do not have like a huge amount of experience, especially autism. I don't have a lot of experience of disclosing my diagnosis, because I was diagnosed in January 2020, and then the pandemic happened literally a couple of months later. So largely I've only had to disclose that to my close friends and family, who already are supportive, and a lot of my lovely colleagues as well. Many of them are therapists, and if they're not therapists, then they're working for a mental health charity. So my experience with that might be quite biased, but I've had like quite a positive experience with that. The BPD, I don't really disclose it as much anymore, because I now just don't think it's necessarily accurate. But I think before, most commonly people didn't know much about it. That was one of them. The people who did know anything about, or had even heard of borderline personality disorder, seemed a bit taken aback by when they realized it, probably due to all of the stigma and stereotypes that the diagnosis holds. I had a few people tell me that they don't think that the label seems to fit me as well. But yeah, the BPD, I think, probably far more negative reactions than than the autism.
What do you think people misunderstand most about both anxiety and autism?
So in terms of, let me think. So I've actually done some prep for this. I'm trying to like make it like relatively succinct. I think a lot of people misunderstand how autism presents outside of the stereotypical white male boy playing just with trains and being good at maths and having really big issues with communication and socializing. That's what people see when they think of autism, and don't necessarily know much at all about how it can present outside of that narrow understanding of like a small section of the autistic population, which is obviously they're also valid autistic people, but like there are so many different like presentations of autism that people just don't know enough about. And I was guilty of that myself in the past, when I just didn't understand enough about autism, and I only truly started to understand more about it when I started my current role, and then through my own learning when I started considering autism for myself. I think a lot of people were really surprised when I was diagnosed because of that, because people just don't kind of understand how it can be, and especially how it presents in, I won't say just women, but you know, people who don't present as cis males. It's just very different. I think having some like celebrities recently coming out as having been diagnosed as autistic is quite a helpful thing in the public. I think also people don't understand what is meant by the autistic spectrum. I think people tend to think that the spectrum is from one end to the other, like a linear scale, from really, really autistic, severely autistic, to just kind of a little bit autistic at the other end. And actually it's more like, if you think like a color wheel, I have like all the different sort of strengths and challenges which everybody has, and everyone will have different placings on that, and their color wheels will all look completely different. And how diverse the autistic population is, because some people can literally have opposite struggles. So some people might, for example, be sensory seeking and eat really, really spicy food, whilst another autistic person would just eat really, really bland food and can't touch anything with even a hint of spice because it's too overwhelming. And then I guess like what meltdowns and shutdowns look like, and with mental health things, how dissociation looks as well. I spent the first year or so post-diagnosis with autism not believing that I had ever had meltdowns, and it wasn't something that I struggled with, until I went to some post-diagnostic support groups and realized that actually what I had previously described as short-term mental health crises, which were often like, you know, over an evening, was actually an autistic meltdown, which happened like more during times of poor mental health and like included my self-injury within it.
Thank you. And what could people do to make your life easier?
I think in order to make my life easier, people could just hold my disability in mind and consider and ask me relevant things about the environment, communication, my sensory needs, things like that. Simple things like giving me more information about going somewhere than you might for another person, like providing specific timings and the layout of a place and what the specific plan is. Being very clear and creating the opportunity for an open, continuous dialogue where I feel safe to seek clarification and reassurance and support, and not to feel like I'm asking for too much by seeking clarity, to feel safer and put reasonable adjustments in place. Not making me feel stupid for asking what I think might be silly questions as well. listening to what I say and not necessarily how I say it, because often my facial expressions, tone of voice, etc. won't match what I'm saying. So I might say something very serious about feeling like I'm at risk of harm from myself whilst smiling, and the mismatch with that has caused me no end of difficulties in the past and has had me like discharged from services and all sorts of things, and just not taken seriously. Yeah, I think giving me enough time to process things and work out how I feel emotionally before I have to give an immediate response, because as well as the autism, I also have alexithymia, so that means I can't necessarily recognize and process my emotions in the same way as other people, and so I've found it really important to have people be aware of that, especially in my close relationships, like with my girlfriend. She will give me a little bit of time and say, do you need a bit of space to work out how you feel about it before we have a conversation? And that just changes everything. And I think sometimes having important information given in writing as well, especially at work, has helped. And giving me alternative options to communicate when I'm struggling to do so, like asking yes or no questions, or encouraging me to use my text to speech app on my phone, or by writing things down or typing them if I'm like struggling to speak.
Could you talk me through an average day of yours? Pre-pandemic, so
pre-pandemic.
Yeah, pre-March 2020, what would have been just an average day for you?
See, this is where you start to get the like unmasked version of me where I haven't got all the prep in front of me. Okay, so an average day pre-pandemic would have involved me getting up very early in the morning, like 6 something in the morning, having a shower, getting ready, going into my office and working 9 to 5. Sometimes that meant running around coordinating a teaching day, greeting external speakers, setting up rooms, answering student queries, resolving all the tech issues, sometimes having assignment submissions to deal with. Anyway, lots of a very busy atmosphere in a open plan office. And I was doing that Monday to Friday. And then I'd also have therapy on a Wednesday morning, which was in person. And then generally speaking, by the end of work, I'd not really do very much, to be honest, because I'd just be exhausted from work. So I'd come home and just kind of lay in bed watching TV mostly. That was generally it. And depending on how overwhelming the day had been, I may or may not be able to have enough energy left to cook a meal and do normal things like that at the end of it.
Are there things that you feel you learned because of your autism and your anxiety and mental health challenges?
In general?
Yeah, in general. Things that you think you can do, or you learn that other people who don't have it might not learn or not understand as well as you.
I think I learned a lot of things about myself because of my disability, because of my autism specifically. Just who I am, why things affect me, helpful ways to adapt things in life to make things easier, adjustments that other people can make for me, ways to explain my difficulties in a way that I couldn't before, and that there was a valid reason for me to struggle with things that I did. But I don't know if there's specific things that I feel that I know better than other people necessarily because of it. I think maybe my disability makes me a little bit more empathetic than some other people. I tend to find that a lot of people seem to feel comfortable coming to talk to me when they're struggling with things, because I'm quite obviously someone who's going to get it. I am quite vocal about the fact that I am autistic and about my anxiety, and I regularly walk around with short sleeves on. People are very aware that I'm a self-harmer, so I think that that actually kind of makes other people feel like they're able to be a bit more open and come to me to seek support.
Thank you. And if we now think about the start of the pandemic, so if we travel back in time to late March 2020, when you first heard about coronavirus, COVID-19, the pandemic, what were your sort of your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions at that point in time?
So when I first heard of COVID-19 and the idea of a pandemic, initially I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. I think a lot of us underestimated it and didn't think it was going to have a huge impact on us. I remember having a conversation with one of my colleagues on the day before our office closed, and she said, "Don't worry, I can't see us closing at any time soon. If we do, it'll probably just be for a couple of weeks." And yeah, obviously that changed very quickly.
And how has your daily routine, your average day changed since the pandemic started?
So I'll incorporate some of the answers to the previous one into the next one, I think. So everything changed massively for me as soon as the main pandemic kind of hit, and it became evident that it was a far bigger problem than we'd initially thought it would be. When I got the message that my office was closing, I had a huge reaction to it. I got home and I sobbed, and I don't remember sobbing like that for like years and years before. I literally got in and I just sobbed on the kitchen floor because I was terrified. I didn't know how I was going to get through it. I was terrified of the isolation and the change in every single aspect of my life. I didn't know how I was going to deal with it, how I was going to adapt to an entirely new way of working. We had to then literally overnight, adapt to running and coordinating a course remotely, which we'd never done at all previously. I became the guinea pig for doing so because I had teaching which was running literally the next working day. So yeah, it was insane. it was every single thing changed really, really fast. I went from working 9 to 5 in the office Monday to Friday to literally being like trapping myself in my small attic bedroom. I was scared of leaving my bedroom. I was scared of using communal areas in the flat because my flatmates were still going out to work, and I also struggle with health anxiety. So I was quite worried about catching the virus. I wouldn't go anywhere in my flat without like touching everything with a wipe. I kept like my own pots and pans and cutlery and everything in my bedroom. I would only go out when I could hear that everywhere was not occupied. So yeah, it changed everything. And at the beginning, I think I got by on adrenaline alone, just because I was having to work out how on earth we function. How do we keep teaching running? How do we keep everything happening in a completely new way whilst none of us are together to figure it all out? And adapting to online meetings. My therapy went online immediately as well, and I'd never done that. I previously wasn't someone who was ever comfortable with a video call. I would have just said, no, I'm not doing it. And then I literally just had to straight away just be like, right, I'm going to do everything on video now. So yeah, it was madness.
Text appears. Now that things have opened up again, how have your days changed?
Now that the pandemic is slowing, now that things are reopening. Life is not the same as it was before the pandemic. We now don't work full-time in the office anymore, and we never will again. We're currently working 2 days a week, 40% of our hours from the office, and the rest from home. And although a lot of neurodivergent people find working from home really, really helpful, a lot of disabled people in general find working from home really useful, I am struggling quite a lot with it. Although it's helpful on some days, when I think, oh, actually, I'm quite anxious. I don't know if I can go out. I don't know if I've managed the commute and things like that. I think I used to survive quite a lot on having that routine, having that regular get up, shower, get into the office, so having the same people around and having a really regular, familiar support system of my colleagues every day being around was really, really helpful. And now it's I'll go into the office and I won't know who's going to be in from day to day. I have like sort of people who I see as like safe, trusted, supported colleagues who I just feel better when they're around, and I don't know when they're going to be around anymore normally, and that's really hard. I think I now do have, I've gone back to therapy face to face once a week. My therapist helpfully increased my therapy to twice a week during the pandemic when I got really unwell, and it stayed like that. And I now have one session online and one session in person, and I can now like go, I'm now much better in terms of like anxiety with the pandemic itself and with catching COVID. Like I'm not really too worried about it. I'm far better at like going out and doing things. I'm seeing people again. I will just go out and sit in a coffee shop just for the afternoon because I want to. And one of the main things that changed for me was that my best friend, who has been my crisis support plan since we were teenagers, has now become available to me again. So when I recently had a mental health crisis, I could turn to her and she could give me face-to-face support, and I could go and stay with her for a few days when I was really unwell, whereas during the pandemic she wasn't an option. And I think that's partly why it was probably the most unwell I've ever been.
Text appears. What was the biggest impact the pandemic had on you?
Impacted everything. It meant that I didn't have any face-to-face support, any social contact with anybody, which I previously relied on my sister, who doesn't live with me, and my colleagues mainly for my social contact. And I now only had that via a screen or on the phone. It changed the way that we work indefinitely. It caused me to have a really bad mental health crisis. I really should have been in A&E probably every 5 days for a period of time, but I was unwilling to go to A&E, so I just dealt with things by myself because I didn't have access to anybody else. I didn't feel safe going to a hospital. I didn't have the person who I always turn to in crisis. So it turned everything around, but I think I hate like cliches like this, but I think I had to go through that awful period in order to get better. I think I ended up being signed off for over 3 months from work during the pandemic, and increasing my therapy and actually having to stop and take a proper look at what was going on and how to change it and what was wrong and how to work out what was wrong in the first place and how to process my feelings and what to do about them. And learning about autism along the way, and how I look at the world and myself and other people and everything, and how to make that easier, has meant that has changed things for me in a really good way.
And have you taken on any new activities, any new hobbies, or anything like that during the pandemic while you were on your own?
So I started to crochet, but that is only as of this year, so I don't think that necessarily counts. So I started that in January 2022. During the pandemic, I had a really lovely supportive colleague who was speaking to me 3 times a week for a while, just to give me like a safe space to like talk about things. And she set me a challenge to keep me busy and occupied of doing an A to Z of lockdown and illustrating it. And so I did, and I've got it actually. Let me show you a little bit of it. So I did like a lockdown of A to Z. So like it's got like A is for anxiety, and then an illustration next to it, and then like B is, well, that's the system that we used, and then C is for coffee, and like there were a few of them, and there were some that I'm more proud of than others. There was like D is for depression, and like I did all of these all the way up to Z, and it kept me really quite busy and quite occupied, but also gave me a way of like channeling how I was feeling. And I'm not normally like a creative person. I wouldn't say that I was like, I'm not very artistic. I'm not really artistic naturally, usually, but doing the A to Z project was really useful for me. As a kind of creative outlet. But other than that, to be honest, I didn't have time to take up any new activities, because my activity at that point was getting through the day. It was really nice to hear other people learning new languages and instruments, but it was really not my experience at that point in time. It was survival.
If you think of other people's behavior, what were some things that really frustrated you throughout the pandemic that other people did that made it harder for you, or that you just didn't understand why they would do that?
I think one of the most frustrating things for me with other people during the pandemic was more about narrative than anything else. It was sort of this narrative that everybody was in the same situation, everyone was in the same boat. The sort of constant sharing of overly positive, like keep calm and carry on stories, and anecdotes about people spending lots of time with their loved ones and sitting out in their gardens making banana bread and learning new skills. And it was nice to hear that not everybody was struggling, and some of the tales were really heartwarming to hear. But at the same time, it felt, when that's all you're hearing, that's makes things feel harder, and it's even more alienating and difficult when you're not in that situation. The situation that I was in, where I was pretty much on my own in a very small room in those same 4 walls, nearly 24/7, scared to use communal areas in my own house or touch things, scared of contracting the virus and going anywhere, having to adapt to working in that way, losing all of my support. I think it was one of the hardest things, was just hearing about how everyone was doing so well in adapting, and it just really didn't help with how difficult it felt to not hear any experiences of anybody else who was also finding this really, really difficult.
And how about the opposite? Were there any things other people did that you found really positive?
I think some of the most positive things for me from the pandemic were the people who went out of their way to be supportive for me and to me. My very lovely colleague who spent hours having long check-ins with me 3 times a week, going way above and beyond, just to give me somewhere and someone safe to talk to about everything and have some sort of consistency of support, meant a huge amount to me and kept me going through that period. And it's a huge reason why I even made it through that period of time. My therapist adding in an extra appointment every week really helped as well when I started to get really unwell. My other colleagues, family and friends generally being really supportive, even if they could only do that from a distance. I also at one point shared a blog post which I've written about my pandemic experience so far in the newsletter at work, along with some of the drawings that I've been doing as my lockdown A to Z. And that had a really lovely warm reception actually from people, and I got some really lovely emails about it after I'd shared it. And some people said to me that actually it was really nice to hear, refreshing to hear a different perspective from other people who are struggling, and that it was validating for them to hear that.
Thank you. And do you feel that having a disability, having autism, having anxiety has in any way prepared you for this, or was it actually the thing that just made it so much harder than those who don't have the same conditions?
I don't think that my disability prepared me for the pandemic at all. I think that it was the problem. I think if I didn't have such high levels of anxiety, if I didn't struggle with health anxiety, if I wasn't a self-harmer, if I didn't struggle with some of the things that come along with autism so much, like change, and a lack of routine and clarity, then I think it would have been an entirely different experience.
Do you think that other intersectionalities that you represent, you said in the beginning, you're a proud queer woman, do you think that had any impact on your experience, or do you think that was more a sideshow and had no real impact on how you experienced the pandemic?
I think in terms of intersectionality, I think the main contributing factors was the fact that I was both autistic and had mental health difficulties, as opposed to it being other factors such as my sexuality. I don't think that necessarily had much of an impact. The way that had an impact was that I managed to find my girlfriend during the pandemic. So that was helpful, but I don't think that's necessarily because of the pandemic as such, although it was actually. I did end up finding my girlfriend directly because I was struggling because of the pandemic, so we have that to thank the pandemic for, at least.
Great. And if we start looking a bit forward, are there any changes that happened during the pandemic to work or to life in general that you would actually like to keep, or would you like things to go back to how they were, say, in February 2020?
I think that there are a lot of things about the pandemic that have changed that are positive for a lot of people. I think now that the majority of society have experienced some things that disabled people experience regularly, like isolation and just various different things. That means that certain changes have been made, like being a bit more flexible with working arrangements, which is really good for a lot of disabled people. Having the ability to work from home more is a really good thing for a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily always work for me, and having, familiar people around in the office and having the routine of going into work more is probably a positive thing for me. But also on some days I can't go into the office. I'm just not well enough to go into the office, but also I'm not ill enough to be off sick. And so on those days, it's really useful to be able to work from home. And before the pandemic, that used to have a real valid reason, and it was sort of frowned upon to ask to work from home. You had to, you know, have a special request or a special reason in place to be able to do that. And now that the majority of the population have experienced some form of working from home, and changing of work-life balance, and people who have been homeschooling and things like that, now that they've realized how positive home working can be and changes generally can be, it's been implemented. It's a shame that it took, you know, non-disabled people experiencing things that disabled people have been experiencing for years and years for these changes to be made. But if it's benefiting, you know, disabled people as well, then that is a positive thing.
Now that everything is opening up, we're coming out of the pandemic, or we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic, what are some things that you are worried about?
I suppose I'm worried about there being another wave of COVID, and I'm hoping that I'm trying very hard not to listen to news. I try and like tune it out completely. I don't go out looking for anything to do with what's going on with COVID, any sort of stats or anything, because it'll just freak me out. So I'm a little bit worried at the back of my mind that this could happen again, and going back to that is a terrifying prospect. Having more sort of lockdowns and having things taken away again, I think would be really, really difficult, and I'd have to seriously think about what the arrangements would be if that were to happen again. What else am I worried about? I'm worried that some of the ways that I used to be able to cope with things, I'll never get back. I feel like I used to be able to do a lot of things just because I powered through and just on adrenaline, and because I always did them. I used to be able to maintain working 5 days in the office back to back, and I'm not sure that I could do that now. As much as I think it was kind of good for me in some ways, it's exhausting. I think even, you know, going to a social event now, even a lot of people are saying, whether they have any disabilities or not, that just learning to socialize again and be around big groups of people is a big challenge. And I'm worried that I might never feel the same way, and I might never be able to do the things that I could before in the same way again. I suppose I'm also a bit worried that some of the changes that have happened that are positive might be short-lived, and that at some point things might just start to slip back once they become less of a priority to the majority of the population.
Could you give an example of what you're thinking about there?
So such as the hybrid meetings and different ways that people are trying to make things more accessible, for example. I feel like that's all well and good, and that's all being put in place now. But if things change and people start having more face-to-face time in different situations and different organizations, then that might slide off the agenda again. I just worry that some things have become a bit of a hot topic, and that then they're just gonna disappear, and then the people who it's benefited the most are going to suffer for that. Can't think of any more specific examples.
That was really good. And coming out of the pandemic, what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to?
Good one. I'm looking forward to there just being more positive experiences of just being happier. And now that I understand myself more and I'm able to advocate for myself far more than I ever have been able to, being able to make life a bit easier for myself, and have other people help with that as well, and not being as afraid to ask. I think people advocating for themselves, whether they're disabled or not, has been a good thing that's come out of the pandemic, because a lot of people have found that they've been in situations, if they've got children or they've got caring responsibilities in other ways, or whatever it might be, they've had to ask work or ask their family and friends for certain accommodations, and that's become more accepted now, I think, and I think that's a really good thing. So I'm looking forward to that being something that I can just carry on doing and that other people can do. And just seeing people more, and like now that I'm having therapy in person again, being able to do like a totally different type of therapy, and being able to see friends more and meeting up with like my family, and just I think appreciating it more than we did before, just realizing what we had, what was lacking, but also what we had, and being able to make changes to that. I think I'm just looking forward to, yeah, life being a bit better.
Do you think the pandemic has changed the way people think about disability?
Lucy looks to the side while she's thinking about her answer. She then folds her hands and rests her head on them.
I have to think on that one. It's difficult because you'd have to ask people. It's hard for me to say how other people think about. This is where the autism comes out, isn't it? I don't know what other people's perspectives necessarily are on disability and whether or not they've changed. I'd like to hope so. I'd like to hope that people think differently about disability now than they did before. But that's in a sort of quite optimistic state of mind, I suppose. I don't know that enough changes have been made, or we've made enough strides at all.
And what would a more disability inclusive society or future look for you? And feel free to focus on autism and mental health. What would it look like to be, a more autism, mental health friendly future? What would that be?
I think a more disability friendly future for me would be one where people actually think about it at all, where it comes into people's conscience in the first place, and they're thinking about how they can do things a bit differently. How could we make this more accessible? And I think that has changed a bit. I think people are thinking about accessibility a bit more now that things are done a lot more online and things like that. There's a lot more focus on that, especially where I work. I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, but we've definitely thought more about how can we make things more inclusive? How can we make this more accessible? And just thinking about is there a need to do it this way? Why, you know, people raising the question, why, one of mine that I bring up at work quite a lot is, why are we doing introductions in all of these meetings? Why in a group of 20 people are we all going around and introducing ourselves when the one new person in the meeting doesn't remember anyone by the end of the introductions? Like, all that's doing is making certain people, like, it terrifies me. Having to do a round of introductions makes me physically shake, like, and all I have to do is say my name a lot of the time and like what my job is. But like, why are we doing it? Why are we putting people through it? Why are we wasting everybody's time? Why are we forcing people to speak who might not be wanting to? Is there a way that we could get people, like ask people whether they're okay with it? Or even, could we give people a heads up in advance? Could we send an agenda around to everybody and make sure that it's accurate, and give someone, if you've got a colleague that you know is autistic or anxious or, you know, whatever, could you, if you are running a meeting, just tell them in advance, this is what we're going to do. Here is a thing that I'm planning on doing about introductions or an icebreaker or something. Are you comfortable with that? If not, how would you like me to manage it? Like, is there a way that we can get around that? Should I change it? Like, do you want to join 5 minutes late so that you miss that section? You know, just like take things into consideration in the first place. Think about it. Why are you enforcing certain policies and procedures? Like, is it just because it's the way that things have always been done? Is it stopping people accessing work, stopping people accessing services, even within your own friendship group? Like, if you've got a friend who struggles in one way or another, who is disabled, are you thinking about their disability? Are you paying attention to what might be hard about that for them? Have you asked them what we could change to make this easier for you? If someone's consistently not turning up to things, have you asked them why that might be? It might just be that switching locations and meeting somewhere that isn't a busy, crowded bar on a Friday evening and moving that to somewhere else might make a world of difference. So I think that's the main thing, is just, it would be nice if people considered accessibility and disability and thought about it a little bit more.
And if you could make a wish, or more than one, for yourself, what would you wish for?
Ooh. I think if I were to make one wish for myself, it would be that the things that I've learned about myself and the ways that I've changed, and the ways I've learned to manage my emotions and life in general, just carries on getting better. And that even if I always struggle with my mental health to one degree or another, that I develop new skills and ways of managing that, and that generally I am feeling positive about life more than I'm feeling negative about it.
Thank you. And my final question, what made you decide to come forward to participate in this documentary?
So I heard about the documentary from the Neurodivergent Staff Network, which is linked to my work. And I thought that it sounded like a really valuable project, which I'd like to be part of, and that given my experiences during the pandemic, that I might have something helpful to contribute towards it, after having quite a challenging time during the pandemic, and having already sort of shared some of the things that I'd experienced with some of my colleagues, and having a positive reception that I might actually have something positive to add. And I thought it was a really, really useful thing to do. And after having people come to me and say that they found me sharing my experiences validating and helpful, and gave them more bravery to share what they'd experienced, that this was just doing the same thing but on a wider scale.
Fade to black. Credits rolling. Directed by Anica, Zeyen and Wade. Protagonist Lucy Matthew. Interviewer Anica Zeyen. Audio description Anica Zeyen. All rights reserved. Copyright 2022 Anica Zeyen and .51 Productions.